Hi, I'm Kat, the apprentice maven. I know some things and I'll teach you, but I don't know a lot more things and I'll teach me too. But mostly we're just gonna have fun. Let's go. Like most of us during quarantine, I have worked to expand my skill set a little bit. So I taught myself how to cross stitch. I've already done a couple of projects and gotten some stuff up on the wall, and because flowery type cross stitchy type patterns are not really my thing, I have opted for some more snarky patterns. The one that I'm going to be working on today is a little on the snarky side. It's a little bit more safe to film and video than some of the other ones that I have completed already. And it also has a panda on it, which reminds me of my grandmother, and I miss her a lot. So I was really excited when I found this project. So you'll get to see me making it, but before we get started, for those of you who don't know how to cross stitch, I'm gonna do a really super quick and dirty tutorial about some things that I learned along the way. If you are trying to learn how to cross stitch, don't learn from me. I don't know what I'm doing. I taught myself during quarantine. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just gonna show you some things that I taught myself along the way, some lessons that were learned, some tips and tricks that I figured out as I was going along. But if you're trying to learn how to cross stitch, learn from somebody a lot more experienced than me. They'll probably teach you a lot more. Yeah, let's get started. So right after I said not to listen to me in terms of learning how to do cross stitch, now I'm going to do some cross stitch tutorial type stuff so you know exactly what I'm doing, because I realized after filming I didn't give you very good views of what I was actually doing. So to start out, we are using size 14 Aida cloth. That's cloth that's specifically made for cross stitch. It is the biggest size that I could find. It's readily available online. It's pretty easy to see the holes. It's great for beginners. So that's what I started with. I also have some embroidery floss. I used DMC is the brand that I picked for embroidery floss. What you want to look for is 6-strand cotton embroidery floss, and it'll say on the package what kind it is. But when you cut it and then you pick it apart, you can see that it actually has 6 strands in there. And so that's what I used. I used tapestry needles. They're commonly used for cross stitch. They are more blunt than regular needles. They're not going to poke you as hard as a regular needle would. I also use a thimble. This is my favorite thimble. I like it particularly because I have longer nails, as you can see. Most people put their thimble on this finger. I actually put mine here because I use right around this part of my finger near the knuckle to push the needle through the fabric like that. So that makes it easier for me. So that's how I wear my thimble. And you're also going to need some scissors, or in my case, thread snips. So the very first thing that you're going to need to do is find a place for your needle. Be right back. I just bought this great little magnetic needle minder. I got it on Etsy. I'll put a link in the description box below, but I really like it. I think it's adorable. You just stick it on your fabric. Little magnetic thing comes on the back, and then you can stick your needle to it and it holds it in place for you. So what you're going to do is, I have found that this size of Aida cloth is good for 3 of the 6 strands. Now as far as I know, you're not going to use all 6 at the same time for any cross stitch. But for this one, I like to use 3. So what you'll do is you'll kind of pick it apart a little bit till you've got 3 on each side. And it's just wound around itself. So you have to separate it into 2 separate strands. And it'll like to bind up on itself, it'll like to bind up on itself like that. So you just have to work it until it separates and plays nice with you. Okay, and go ahead and set one of those aside. The way I like to thread a needle, and this is any needle, is because that although this is a very big head of a needle, it's still quite a bit smaller than that. So what I like to do is I take the pointy side of the needle and lay the thread across it and pull it tight on both sides like that. Then hold it taut and take these two fingers and pinch the thread or floss around. So I've got that in between my two fingers. Then holding it like this, slide your needle out. Now you want to open up your fingers just so you can see, sorry, it's a little blurry. There you go. Just so you can see the start, and then that's when you can take your needle and slide it through like that. And then just kind of pick it through. There you go. All right, I like to slide my two ends pretty close together because then I can have a longer thread and I don't have to have as many stops and starts, which are kind of a pain. And I find that generally with hand sewing, when you have stops and starts, it gives it less structural integrity. So I like to pull it to the end. It gives me lots and lots of thread, floss, whatever to work with. And then we're off to the races. What you're normally going to do is find the center of your pattern. It will be marked in your pattern, and that's generally where you want to start. But what I'm going to do right now is just show you some of the stitches that I'm going to use. Actually, this is a little heavy. I'm going to remove that. So one of the stitches that I do is, actually, I don't know what the name of them is, but one of them, I'm just going to make up my own names, is one of them is I use as a filler stitch. And basically what I do is I go across in one direction and then back, and then move up to the next square, across and back, up to the next one, across and back. And you can fill a very large section of the cloth that way pretty quickly. So when you do your initial start, what you want to do is come up, and you want to put your thread most of the way through and then hold this down with one of your back fingers because you don't want to pull your thing through. Then what you're doing is you're making little X shapes with your thread. But when you're doing the filler stitch, is what I guess I will call it because I don't know what it's actually called, you want to go up and to the right just one. So I'm going to do a little bit closer. And then when you come back through on the other side, you're going to come back through, make sure that you catch, see, I didn't do it. Make sure that you catch your original tail in between the two, because that's what's going to keep it from pulling through. Okay. So let me just kind of arrange that in there a little bit. Okay, now it's in there. So when I pull this through, I now have it trapped in there. And you're going to keep doing that. You want to get as many stitches in there. I like to do at least 4 or 5, usually more than that. But you're just going to do diagonals, and you want to make sure that throughout your entire project, you're starting off in the same direction. So when I'm doing filler, and I'll just, when I have my tail, I'm going to start over. I'm going to turn it over just to check and make sure that tail is caught in there. I don't do this for the entire project, but just when I have a tail. Okay, now that I've got a good solid few stitches, I'm going to go ahead and cut that tail because otherwise it's just going to get in my way. Okay, I'm going to do a few more of these so you can see. Okay, so now that you've got your row going in one direction, now I'm going to go back in the other direction to make my little X's, and then I'm going to go up a row and repeat the same thing. And by doing that, I'm able to fill a much larger section relatively quickly than if I were to do individual X's. Okay, you can see my tail is getting a little bit closer to my work, so I'm going to go ahead and give that a little tiny bit of a tug just to give myself a little bit more room so the tail doesn't get caught in the work. Okay, now we have a little bit of a problem because in order to move up, and I need to go in the same direction that I went before, I already just went down back through this hole toward the back. So if I were to come back out this hole to go up like I did before, I would just undo what I just did. So instead, I'm going to take my first stitch through the top of that next box and go back down. And now I can continue the way I did before, where I'm going bottom to top. Whoops, seem to have gotten a knot. Okay, so that's the filler stitch. The next one is going to be a traveling stitch. Well, that's, again, what I'm calling it because I don't know what it's actually called. So let's say, for example, I have these two rows, but the next thing that I have to do as part of my pattern is do a line that goes all the way up. And then after that, it does more stuff over here. So if I go all the way up with my initial part of the X's, if I just do that all the way up, and then I have to do the second part of my X's going all the way back down the way I did for my filler, that would leave me down here when I finished, rather than leaving me up here where the next part of my pattern is. So it's important to think ahead when you're doing the next part of your pattern to figure out, okay, well, where is that going to leave me when I finish, and what do I have to do next? So this is why I call it a traveling stitch, because instead of doing the way we did it before here, where we go forward and then back, we're just going to do the X's one at a time. It takes a little bit longer, but I'm not going to end up back where I started. I'm going to end up over here where the next part of my pattern is. So as before, I'm going to go into the top part because remember I just finished up in this hole right here. So if I came back out, I would undo that stitch. So I'm going to come up the top part of that box and go back down. And again, I'm still following the same direction that I would if I were to do more filler stitches. Throughout your entire pattern, you want to start bottom to top going the same direction. You don't have to do the same direction that I pick. Your initial part of your X can go in the other direction, but it just makes sure it's consistent throughout your project. So I went bottom left to top right, and now I'm going to finish up my X. Now I'm going to go bottom to top because the next one that I want to do is going to go up here, and it's going to be a little bit easier for me to get there. Okay. All right, now the next one I want to do is in this box right here. So I'm going to come out this hole, go up to that one, and then repeat the same thing and travel up. There you go. Now you kind of get the idea, and then you can continue on your pattern. So these are the stitches I'm going to be using primarily throughout this project. I'm sorry that you don't have as good a view when I'm actually working on the project as this is, but let's get started. Future Editing Cat here. So in addition to the supplies we already talked about, there's a couple of extra things you're going to need and maybe 1 or 2 steps you're going to take. Hi past cat. Yep, let's get started. So this is the Aida cloth. It's the same stuff that I showed you before, the size 14 Aida cloth. And what I did is I took it to my serger and I serged the edges of the Aida cloth. The reason I did this is because I found in past projects it does have a pretty big tendency to fray. So if you have a serger, not a bad idea to do that. If you don't, no big deal, just don't get too close to the edge. You're also going to need a hoop and your thread snips, your threads, whatever threads you're going to need. This project actually has 3, but the 3rd one hasn't come yet. You're going to need your needles, which we already talked about, and your pattern. This is the pattern that I'm going to be using. Kind of cheeky, kind of like it. And of course, your thimble. To get started, you'll need to put your hoop onto your fabric. Now, embroidery hoops come in 2 pieces. One larger hoop on the outside that has a split in the middle, and a smaller hoop on the inside that's all solid. Undo the screw at the top, and then put your smaller hoop in the back of the fabric and line it up with the bigger hoop on the front of your fabric. Then push them together around your fabric. Next, go back and tighten the screw at the top. As you do, you're probably going to need to adjust the fabric to make sure that it's nice and taut. Think of how a drum looks. That's sort of what you want to look for. Next, you're going to want to take your pattern and find center. In this pattern, there are arrows that indicate where the center of the pattern is. That's where you're going to start your cross stitch. Next, find the center of your circle and mark it with your needle. Thread your needle as shown before. And here's where I got started. So the first section that I'm doing here is a filler stitch. Once you get going into your cross stitch, you can sometimes keep an eye on the pattern, meaning, okay, now I have to go over 1, up 1. But when you first start out, you really do need to count your stitches and make sure that you have the correct number for that particular row. So that was me counting stitches. And now we're going back the way we came on our first row. This particular pattern has a number of rows with the exact same number of stitches, and I didn't want to get lost and forget and do the wrong number of stitches. So that vertical line on the left-hand side of my pattern is me marking the number of rows I have to go with that same number of stitches. Once I run out of rows, I know that the pattern changes and I can move on. At this point, I had filled in a whole big section and it was time to make a decision. Am I going to go left or am I going to go right? I decided to go left, but I have to fill in a section on the right-hand side first, then loop back around to do the top of the ears, the bottom of the ears, and then around the head. The stitches finished on the left-hand side, but unfortunately I need to be on the other side. So what I did was thread my needle through the back of the project under all of those vertical stitches to get my thread onto the correct side of the pattern. So I finished the top section of the ears and I ended here on the right. So I did diagonals going down each row, then finished up the X's moving back up each row. Then I could move to the left ear and then continue down the head. Unfortunately, I finished up the right ear on the wrong side, so I have to do that trick again where I go through all the vertical stitches on the back to get myself back over to the correct side so I can finish up that left ear. Once I finished up the left ear, it's time to move down the head in the traveling stitch. And you kind of get the idea, so I just finished up the rest of the head in the same way. More time for decisions. I had to figure out how to do this paw, so I decided to do the diagonals going up and then finish the X's going back down. Then I could move over and finish up the back leg and then finish around the body and his adorable little tail, finishing up at the top. For the back leg, I decided to do a regular traveling stitch back and forth all the way up the leg. That way I didn't have to come back down and then fight my way up to do the rest of the body. When I was finished, I just turned the project over and fed the needle through the vertical stitches on the back to hold the thread in place so there's no tail, nothing flopping around, everything's neat and tidy. In order to do the eyes, I had to do more counting. Had to figure out where this thing was supposed to start. Now it's time for the text at the bottom, and as you can see, I did my counting ahead of time off camera. That little dot there is the first stitch on the N for nope. Now that I've finished with the black thread, it's time to move on to the white thread and fill in all this space. And if you look very close, there's a little smiley face that's actually the closed eye. So it's sort of hard to see because the thread is white, but what I decided to do was the half traveling stitch where I do the diagonals all the way up to the top of the eye and then finish up the crosses going all the way back down. Unfortunately, I did forget to film the stitching of the closed eye, but I did put it in a little bit later. Once I finished that, I went back over to the left side of the eye and filled in that little tiny section, and then I finished up the top right under the ears. Since there was nothing in the way on the body of our little panda, I went ahead and filled that in with a nice traveling stitch. Unfortunately, the color difference doesn't show up very well, but there is a slight shadow below our panda. So I got a very light gray fabric and started to fill in the bottom section, the same way I did before. I started at our panda's nose, and to get past that front paw, I had to go under the threads to get back to the other side of the paw so I could finish up there. When you finish your project, the first thing you're going to want to do is remove your stitching assistant and set it aside. Then unscrew your embroidery hoop and remove it from your project. So that's it. He's done, and I love him. He is absolutely adorable. Here is what the finished product looks like. How freaking cute is he? My goodness. The thing that I did forget to record is this little closed eye part. I forgot to record it. I'm sorry. Next time, Gadget. Next time. But I love him. He's adorable. He reminds me of my grandmother, and I just have to find the right kind of frame and put him up on the wall. If you're learning how to do cross stitch and you have some patterns that you'd like to share, I would love to see them. Post comments in the below, tell me what you're working on, tell me how much progress you've made, tell me about your quarantine projects. I want to hear about it. So that's it for now. Till next time, bye. You okay, buddy? You all right? Okay. You're an invasive species. So cute. Settle in, bud. Lay down. Come on, there's sewing going on here. Can you lay down and also not stand there? Ow. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Well, I guess I'll be back when he's settled in.